Asian elephants are, as you know, very not just close to my heart, but they're such an important species. I think we should all be working to conserve together. And I think it's really important to put the message out there like, become an Ellie ally. You don't have to do much to become one, but I think it's a really important opportunity to think about how we can work together to save them well into the future.
Welcome to Nature Breaking, a World Wildlife Fund podcast focused on news and trends affecting our natural world and the people and species who call it home. I'm Seth Larson. Next week, we'll mark World Elephant Day on August 12th, so today's episode is going to focus on some of the threats facing wild elephants and a new initiative aimed at helping to conserve them. More specifically, we'll be talking today about Asian elephants. Did you know that there are actually 3 different kinds of elephants? Our planet is home to Asian elephants, African savanna elephants, and African forest elephants. You'll learn more about the difference between those species today, but for starters, Asian elephants and African forest elephants are slightly smaller than their savanna brethren. Asian elephants are most at risk from habitat loss and the resulting conflict that causes with the people who live in the region. To put a finer point on that, it's estimated that Asian elephant populations have decreased from over 100,000 at the start of the 20th century to under 50,000 today. But crucially, those remaining Asian elephants occupy just 5% of their original range area. That means they are increasingly competing with people for land, food, and water. Joining us today to talk more about this is Nilanga Jayasinghe, WWF's Manager of Asian Species Conservation. Nilanga will bring us up to speed on the specific threats facing Asian elephants and how a new initiative called Elly Allies aims to address them, with a specific focus on driving progress in Southeast Asia and China. Before we turn to the interview, please take a moment to subscribe and rate this show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're catching this episode. And now, here's my conversation with Nilanga. Okay, joining me now is Nilanga Jayasinghe, WWF's Manager of Asian Species Conservation. Nilanga, welcome back to Nature Breaking.
Thank you, Seth. It's really great to be here. Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thank you for coming to me with the idea for this episode. I really appreciated it. So, Nilanga, I want to start here. What makes Asian elephants stand out from African elephants, and why are you personally so passionate about them?
That's a great question, Seth, and I get asked this a lot. Can you explain some of the things that make them different? There are more than 10 characteristics that are, that make Asian elephants distinct from African elephants. Of course, we know that there's 3 species of elephants: the African savanna elephant, the African forest elephant, and the Asian elephant. So I'll stick to the big picture, differences between the African ones and the Asian ones. I would say that the biggest thing that you'll notice when you look at the species and the first shot, look at a picture, look at them in the wild, the first thing you'll see is that the ear size is different, right? The size of the African elephant's ear is a lot bigger and almost shaped like the continent of Africa, if you look at it closely.
Interesting.
Whereas Asian elephants have smaller ears. They are almost, in a way, if you look at it, if you're likening it to something, almost shaped like the subcontinent of India. Not quite, but if you want to think of a difference, along those lines, that would be one of the things I would look for. That's the biggest thing that you'll notice. Also, if you're looking at them in comparison next to each other, African elephants are much larger than Asian elephants. They're taller, they could be heavier. And another clear distinction is that with African elephants, both males and females grow tusks. So when they are, for instance, targeted for the ivory trade, both males and females can be killed for their tusks.
Gotcha.
Whereas Asian elephants, only males grow tusks. And because historically they were poached out for a long time, tusked males, or tuskers as we call them, there are far fewer in existence today. So it's a smaller percentage of the Asian elephant population today, rather, that still carry tusks. So that's another clear distinction, I think, that's important to make in terms of something that really differentiates the 2 species.
Yeah,
Of course, there are
absolutely.
many other things: the numbers of their toes on the front feet, the how many lips they have at the tip of the trunk, the shape of the forehead, the doming of the back, or like the shape of the back, and whether it's straight or sort of slightly sloped. Those are some other things that differentiate the two.
Gotcha. And so tell me where your love for Asian elephants comes from.
Yeah, I grew up in Sri Lanka, which is one of the 13 Asian elephant range countries. I'm a proud Asian. And I will say that just growing up around them, seeing them as I was growing up, largely because there is also a captive Asian elephant population on the continent, and there are quite a few in Sri Lanka as well. I always grew up seeing them being walked from one place to another, and that's kind of one of my earliest memories. And one of my earliest memories is also associated with the sound of a bell
Hmm.
because these elephants wore this big bell around their necks, and when they were walked from place to place, it would ring like a slow, jangle of the bell
Oh,
as they
yeah.
moved from side to side. Their, kind of their gait, corresponding with the gait. And every time I heard that, I knew what it was. So
Yep.
I would like immediately run to the window or the gate of the house and just fascinatedly stare at them until they were, you could see the tail disappearing into the distance. So I've always been really fascinated by them as a species. And the older I got, I learned more about them, about their intelligence, their capacity for empathy, their sort of role in the ecosystem, and the many functions that they provide, and just who they are as a species just always spoke to me. And I really, to this day, think of them as my spirit animal. And it was always, I never thought I'd work in conservation as, part of my career journey, but it's really been a full circle moment to be actually working on elephant conservation today in my job. So it's a really special opportunity for me to work on Asian elephant conservation.
Yeah, and I love the passion that comes through in your voice when you're telling that story and when you're talking about this species. I think it's always wonderful when you hear about people who develop a real love for something early in life and are able to make a career out of that and make a living from it, and in your case contribute to saving that thing that you love so much and keeping it vibrant and intact for the next generation to fall in love with. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Um, and I I want to keep the conversation moving, and I briefly mentioned this in my intro, but I'd love for you to just tell us about some of the threats that
Hmm.
are most prominently facing Asian elephants. I know that there's some overlap with the threats that face African elephants, but
Hmm.
there's also just some more specific threats to Asian elephants that I'd love for you to just speak to a little bit.
Yeah, and I would say this is not unique to the species in particular, but on the Asian continent, I would say these are some of the more prominent threats that species in general face, but Asian
Mm,
elephants in particular.
gotcha.
I'll start by saying that there are less than 50,000 wild Asian elephants left in the wild in 13 range countries.
Hmm.
And the other bigger factor to think about that sets the stage for it is the fact that they're found on the most populated continent on the planet.
Yeah.
Asia has billions of people. It is extremely populated. That also means there's competition for space and resources. So they are fast running out of space, in
Yeah.
fact. So habitat loss is the biggest threat that they're facing in Asia. And of course, very much related to that are chances of human elephant conflict occurring because they're more regularly coming into contact with people, human dominated landscapes. They, as a large mammal, they have large space and resource needs, and they range very widely, meaning that they travel long distances to meet their ecological needs. So during those travels, they're more and more likely now to encounter people,
Hmm.
given that protected areas are shrinking. And we always talk about the fact that animals don't adhere to man-made boundaries of protected areas, or human defined boundaries of protected areas rather. And they will travel the areas that their families have traveled for many thousands of years. So they're more likely to come into contact with people, and that leads to negative interactions, which we call human wildlife conflict, or human elephant conflict in this case. But also, we also see cases of poaching and the illegal wildlife trade related
Hmm.
to elephants. I mentioned earlier, you might recall, that only male Asian elephants carry tusks.
Yeah.
But any tusker that's still around is still targeted for their tusks for
Yeah.
the ivory trade. I will also say that we started noticing a trend emerging around 2016, 17 or so, that became a little bit more robust at the time, is a trade for elephant skin, We started noticing that
Huh.
elephants were being killed. We started noticing this in Myanmar at the time when we were doing radio collaring of elephants to understand their movement and habitat use. And we realized a number of them were being found with the collars cut and large chunks of skin removed. And then we started seeing more and more of that happening and realized that there was this insidious trend that was emerging for the demand for skin. And what that was being used for, we found, was also, the subcutaneous layer of the skin was hardened and powdered and mixed with herbs and sold as treatments for topical skin diseases like eczema and dermatitis with no
Yeah.
actual medicinal value behind it. It's just a way for folks to make money. They're also being hardened and sold and turned into bracelets and necklaces and sold as good luck charms. So
Yep.
these are some of the ways that people find to make money off wildlife, for instance. And so that was something else we saw. Sometimes there's also the opportunity for poachers to target baby elephants from the wild, for instance, live trade, we would say, illegally
Oh.
capturing babies in the wild and taking them into captivity for things like the tourism trade, things like
Yep.
that. So there is still a threat of poaching in the wild for elephants. And a couple of other issues I want to highlight is, of course, we're seeing more and more infrastructure development happening on the continent, across the world, in fact,
Of
right?
course.
Because countries are developing, they want to grow, they want their economies to grow. And we're not saying there's anything wrong with that, but the fact is, it's important to make sure that infrastructure development is done sustainably,
Yep.
because unsustainable infrastructure development can not only fragment or disrupt connectivity for wildlife, fragment habitat. It can also lead to the death of wildlife as they're crossing roads and collisions with cars or trains or whatever it may be. It can also lead to an increase in other issues, in surrounding areas like deforestation or broader poaching or things like that. So we have to take into consideration, how can we do this sustainably and grow sustainably while still bringing in resources that are needed for a country's economic growth, for instance. So
Yeah.
that's another issue. And something else we're seeing in certain parts of Asia are small population isolations, where elephant groups and smaller populations are further being fragmented into smaller and smaller pockets of habitat where they have no connectivity to meet or breed with other groups of elephants in other areas, so that eventually that population or that group may become smaller and smaller and smaller and eventually go extinct.
Right.
So those small population isolations are really important to keep an eye on, because you're losing genetic diversity, and you're also losing important populations of elephants. So some of these things are threats that we need to look at, we need to address, and be sort of proactive about addressing.
Yeah. So that's a lot of different pressures facing elephants, and a lot of different cross-cutting problems to stay on top of. I want to put a little bit of a finer point on the human wildlife, human elephant conflict piece of this. You talked about how, elephants have a wide range. They also have a large need for resources like food and water, and that because they are in such a populous region, they're increasingly coming into contact and conflict with people. But what does that look like in practice? Because, like, my understanding, I know an example I've heard before is for farmers in throughout Asia, they really can see elephants as a threat, or at bare minimum a nuisance, because elephants don't know that a farmer's property that they're growing crops on to sell or to sustain their family is not intended for the elephants. So they may wander into a vegetable patch and eat all those vegetables because they're hungry, or what have you. And a farmer might logically react by fighting back against the elephant, or even killing it in some instances, right? Which is very sad,
Right.
but you
Right.
also you can also understand where they're coming from, because they're trying to protect their livelihoods.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the crux of a typical example of human elephant conflict, or are there other examples that spring to mind?
That would be the biggest one I would flag is, crop loss, livelihood impacts to people, often with one visit from a group of elephants overnight. a farmer could lose half a year's worth of income, for instance,
Yeah.
or a significant chunk of their income. That is the biggest thing we're seeing. Or they could come into a plantation and destroy a lot of crops, things like that. So agricultural impacts are key. Sometimes they can also damage houses and property. We do know of stories where people have stored grains or vegetables and things inside their houses, and elephants have smelt that
Ah,
and come and broken into the house to try to get at that. So that causes significant damage and loss for families. Of
yeah.
course, we can never underestimate the fact that there's also the opportunity for significant injury and even death resulting from encounters with elephants. Often it's accidental. Accidentally, people encounter an elephant and you spook the elephant, people get spooked, and it results in tragedy.
Yeah.
These things can happen. Also, I would say that, speaking of disruption of connectivity, if there is activity, human activity happening in a corridor that's often used by or has been used by elephants for many generations, and their disruption is, or their movement is disrupted rather, that can also lead to significant levels of conflict because they're just trying to get through, but they have barriers in the way. So some of these things, can lead to conflict and exacerbate conflict over time as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about solutions then. And
Yeah.
I want to know, before we get to, the crux of this conversation is really going to be about this new initiative, Elly Allies, that we'll talk about in a minute, that you are kicking off. But more generally, what kinds of strategies have actually proved effective at reducing or managing human-elephant conflict over the years? And I'd love for you to just share an example or two of things that have been done that actually made a difference.
Yeah. I think the most important, there are many different things that actually need to be done on the ground to be able to manage conflict effectively over time. And that, in fact, needs to consider, whether you're preventing it from happening once it's happened or as it's happening. How are you going to mitigate the impacts by, buffering losses to communities, etc.? Or how are you responding to the situation as it's happening? Or are there good policy measures in place to enable people to address conflict in an effective way, whether it be from different stakeholder perspectives, right? There are a lot of people that are involved in a conflict situation. It's not just the immediate people who are impacted by it, but there are a lot of other players that could be relevant or associated with the situation. It could be NGOs that are supporting reducing the conflict as it's happening. It could be government agencies, could be development groups or companies or corporations. Anyone who is involved in either being impacted by or impacting human wildlife conflict in any way should be involved as stakeholders and partners in figuring out how to manage it effectively. I will
Yeah.
say that first and foremost. But we have seen what has been done more prominently. It's been a lot of, prevention is important, as we say, before it happens, right? So a lot of preventative measures have been put in place on the ground, like electric fencing, for instance, which has been kind of found to be really effective as long as it's done in a way that doesn't create barriers for elephant movement. Like if you don't put an electric fence in the way of an actual movement corridor,
Yeah.
then it will be effective. Just making sure that you're preventing elephants from getting into crop fields or community areas in a way that is strategic after you've done some movement mapping, and you put that in place and you manage it well over time without letting that current break on the fence, or just making sure you're maintaining it on a regular basis. I mean, that's been known to be the most effective. But I will also put the caveat in there: elephants are extremely intelligent. And we have heard so many amazing stories of how sometimes an elephant will carry a log in its trunk, bring it over and drop it on the fence and just break the current, right? There's actually great video clip of, males with tusks have discovered that the tusks themselves don't conduct electricity.
Oh,
So they
really?
figured out how to very carefully place the tusks on the wire with the trunk lifted, of course,
Uh
not
huh.
touching it because they know what'll happen if it touches. And then it very carefully lowers the wire until it breaks with the tusks.
Wow.
So they are able to figure things out. It's really important to stay a couple of steps ahead of them because they are very intelligent animals. So prevention, as I mentioned, is really important. But are you doing everything else that's associated that should be helping in the broader landscape of conflict management is what's also important, right? Do you have, if people do lose their crops or there's injury or death, are there mechanisms to sort of support people in those situations? Compensation for damages or losses and things like that, and support for situations like that in managing both preventing and responding, all of that stuff. It's important to have a robust system in place, but also we need to look at what drivers might be impacting the conflict, what has actually led to the conflict, and what is actually potentially escalating that conflict.
Yep.
Could that be additional habitat loss, barriers in the way of movement corridors, and any other kinds of impacts we see that could be exacerbating the situation, driving elephants from one area to another where you're suddenly seeing an escalation in human elephant conflict.
Yeah.
So, looking at that as a big picture more holistically and looking how you implement your management measures in an integrated way is really important if we want to think about long-term solutions. Because if you're just putting in a fence somewhere, just using sound deterrence somewhere else, or doing, measures in a piecemeal way will only be just a band-aid on the issue. You're going to have to keep doing it for a very long time unless you're looking at how to address it more holistically and in a broad manner.
Yeah. So, okay, just to summarize that, so prevention on the front end, whether that be through a fence or some other measure, having a process in place to help landowners recoup damages or homeowners recoup damages that might be caused if an elephant does encroach on their property and cause some damage, and more holistically, in a broader sense, just being mindful of what changes are happening in the landscape that might be driving these elephants to break into these areas they haven't previously been, and being mindful of addressing those things as well.
Maybe I'll also add, Seth, I think an important piece that I didn't mention before is when you're looking to address conflict in any given situation, you have to fully understand the context first.
Yeah.
With the same species, it could be very different situations one village over to the next. One village could be experiencing crop damage in their fields. And as I mentioned before, the next village could be experiencing an elephant breaking into their house because they're storing vegetables or fruits or whatever the case may
Yeah.
be. So, how you address it needs to be extremely context specific. You cannot just scale up electric fencing, for instance, because that may not be applicable in every situation. It may not be the right tool in every situation. So it's really important to consider what you're looking at first and then think about implementing your measures to manage the situation. And I'll also add here that the really important piece at the end of the day that you have to think about is tolerance.
Yeah.
Are people living with wildlife like elephants or any other species? Are they willing to live with them? Are they willing to tolerate them? And that tolerance is a key piece in how you move towards some level of coexistence with communities. And for even building up tolerance, it's important for those most impacted by human wildlife conflict, which often more than not are poor and marginalized communities all over the world. So you have to ensure that they're benefiting from living with wildlife. So livelihood opportunities and other things, and what other benefits can they derive from being able to live with wildlife than to be able to be willing to tolerate living with them. So those are
Completely.
important things to consider and think about as you're looking at the big picture in conflict management as well.
Absolutely. I mean, if I try to put myself in the shoes of someone who is living in an area that would be in conflict with elephants, and of course, like if you see elephants as a valuable and essential part of your community, and or if you know that if those elephants cause harm to you or your property, that there's a process in place for you to be able to be made whole, then your reaction to elephants being a little bit annoying or getting in your way is going to be different than if that isn't in place. So that makes
Absolutely.
all the sense in the world.
Right.
So I want to talk now about this new initiative, Elly Allies, which is intended to deploy some of the strategies you just talked about,
Yeah.
focusing specifically in Southeast Asia and China. And I wanted to ask how this initiative came together, what exactly it aims to do, and I also have to ask you where the name Elly Allies came from.
Yeah. Good question, Seth. Thank you. So The reason we decided to focus on this area is because we're looking at 8 countries in the region, 8 of the 13 range countries. So looking at Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and China. These 8 countries have significantly lower elephant populations, if you look at it more broadly in the grand scheme of all of the range countries. The biggest Asian elephant population is found in India, and then mostly in South Asia, I would say. And across these 8 countries, we think roughly there may be about 8 to 11,000 individuals in the wild. That's a pretty small number if you look at it across 8 countries, and that may even be at the higher end of the estimate because robust population analyses have not really been done. So we don't really know exactly how many there may be to their estimates, right? So we gauge from the estimates that this may be what it is, which also equates to about 16th to a 20th to a percentage of the entire wild Asian elephant population.
Wow.
So if you look at those numbers, you see that there needs to be a lot more effort, hopefully, that we can put into place in this region to really boost up elephant conservation efforts. I mean, it would really be a sad, sad day if we ever end up in a place where we have no elephants anymore.
Yeah.
They would have significant ecosystem impacts. They would just have a general sort of downward trajectory on human well-being, I would say. If we lost elephants, everyone loves elephants, right? They're such an amazing, magnificent species. So there needs to be more of an effort to expand and scale up conservation efforts in this region in particular, which is why we decided to have a focused initiative that looks at elephant conservation efforts and ramping up these efforts in this particular region, which was kind of the impetus for moving forward this new initiative that we have called Elly Allies. So you asked about the name. Where did that come from?
Yeah.
So you see the second word of the name is allies, right? So really the whole initiative was founded on collaboration and allyship because we cannot do this alone. As a conservation organization, there's only so much we can do, but everyone else, if we all come together, we can do so much more for elephants and wildlife in general. But I would say here we're focused on elephants in this region. The general public, people on the ground who live alongside elephants, government agencies, companies and corporations that may be sourcing products from these regions where the elephants are found that can have a significant impact in supporting conservation of elephants. Development sector, anyone that has some role to play in supporting elephant conservation should come together in this situation and be allies in helping move forward elephant conservation. So, which is why we decided to call it Elly Allies, to really demonstrate how we are focused on partnerships and collaborations.
Gotcha. And so what's the approach going to be through this initiative to engage the public, governments, and those other potential allies? What are the first steps to get this up and running, and what are you looking to accomplish in the coming months?
Yeah, so there are 3 main pillars of our work under this initiative. The first, of course, I mentioned before, the biggest threat is habitat loss. So the first pillar of our work is really focused on habitat conservation, restoration, improving connectivity, things along those lines that really impact habitats. How do we move that work forward? The second pillar of our work, and I mentioned earlier, the second biggest threat is human-elephant conflict. So the second pillar of our work is focused on managing human-elephant conflicts. How do you live with elephants? So really focused on moving some of the work that we've been doing forward on the ground and expanding those efforts. And the third pillar of work is called restoring elephant populations, which is kind of encompasses a number of different things that we want to do. One of the things under that pillar of work is we need to learn more about elephant populations in that region. As I mentioned, there's not a lot that we know because those populations are also elusive. It's difficult to understand them. So we want to, learn more about them by doing, sort of population assessments, putting GPS collars on some individuals to understand where they're moving, what are their habitat needs, what are important movement pathways, etc. We also want to then focus on the issues of poaching and the illegal wildlife trade. So how do you improve protections on the ground? How do you address the trade? And how do you address demand?
Yeah.
We also want to focus on small population management in places where populations may be small and at risk of extinction over time. How do we maybe then actively manage those populations? We also then want to look at the health of elephants through a One Health approach. There may be diseases that are impacting them in the wild that we need to understand more about to make sure that those are not going to lead to sort of wiping out populations over time. So
Gotcha.
those are the programmatic areas of work that we're focusing on under this initiative. But also we have some supporting things that we want to do to really ramp up the effort. And as I mentioned, the allyship, right? So partnerships are really, really important, working with partners on the ground at the regional level, more globally, to really push elephant conservation forward. We want to improve communications efforts for Asian elephants because this is something you and I have talked about before as well.
Yeah.
But I think just globally, Asian elephants don't get as much attention. They're the most endangered of the three species of elephants, and yet they don't get nearly enough attention. That would help build up more support for them and more funding and resources to help further their conservation. So the big effort here is to increase those communications platforms and messaging and material that we're putting out there to raise more awareness of their plight and that really urgent need for supporting and expanding elephant conservation efforts in Asia, particularly in this region, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
And of course, the third part of that is fundraising. We need resources to sustain this effort well into the future. So we need to make sure teams and partners, everyone that's working on this on the ground, has the resources to move this agenda forward. So that's in a nutshell the big picture of what we want to do under Ellie Allies. It's ambitious, but what I believe is if we really want to make a significant change, we have to think big. So I'm really excited about where this is going to go, all of the collaborations we're going to build and how we can really make a difference for Asian elephant conservation.
Yeah. No, I think ambitious is definitely the right word. You just walked through a whole host of strategies that you're going to be working through this initiative. It sounds like a lot of work. It sounds really exciting and hopefully really impactful. So just thinking about allies and needing to attract more allies to this mission, you and I work for a conservation group, so we obviously care about saving species, but I'm mindful that not everyone around the world and not everyone in the regions that you're going to be focusing Ellie Allies on might be as passionate as we are about saving wildlife. So for someone who might not necessarily be an elephant lover, why should they care about protecting elephants and elephant ecosystems?
Absolutely. So elephants are what we call a flagship species or a keystone species.
Yeah.
And what that means is that because of their large space and resource needs, we need to make sure we're protecting large swaths of space. Whether it is, in the form of a protected area or a conserved area. We have a very robust movement now towards the Convention on Biological Diversity's goal of reaching 30% of protected areas by 2030, 30 by
Right.
30 as we call it. So conserved areas, which are not traditional protected areas, but include very inclusive conservation approaches. All of that space, however it's being managed, if it's conservation compatible, will be helpful for wildlife conservation. So what that means is when you're doing this type of landscape scale conservation, that doesn't just include protected areas, but all these other areas that are around it. If you are ensuring a broader conservation mandate under all of that, you are also really helping people at the same time
Yeah.
because a lot of these wild spaces provide services to us that we do not think about on a daily basis. There a lot of freshwater sources come from these places. Clean air that trees are able to regulate, for instance. Other services like pollination, bees and other pollinators serve such a key role that are found in these places where we get wild, fruits or whatever that we source, or even medicinal plants. We barely scratch the surface in how useful medicinal plants are, whether it be for curing disease or other, things that are needed for human health and well-being as well, that we're just starting to discover. So all of these things are found in these amazing wild spaces, and we need those to be able to survive as a species. So I think there are much larger benefits to conserving not just elephants, but wildlife more generally, and the spaces that they need to survive that ultimately benefit us in turn. So I would say that even if you're not a wildlife lover, I think wildlife conservation and conserving their habitats and ecosystems at large can have significant positive impacts for all of us.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really well said, and that's something that we've talked about on this show related to other species as well, whether it be tigers or what have you.
Yeah.
So, Nilanga, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but before I let you go, I wanted to just ask, what else would you like people to know about Ellie Allies and
Yeah.
about saving Asian elephants?
Yeah. Asian elephants are, as you know, very not just close to my heart, but they're such an important species. I think we should all be working to conserve together. And I think it's really important to put the message out there like, become an Ellie ally. You don't have to do much to become one, but I think it's a really important opportunity to think about how we can work together to save them well into the future.
Great. Well, Nilanga, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Seth. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks again to Nilanga for joining the show today. I always learn so much when I talk to her, and I think her passion for elephant conservation really shines through. Asian elephants remain endangered today, and they need our help. So I hope this conversation inspires countries and individuals to heed Nilanga's words and become Ellie Allies to help ensure a better future, both for elephants and for the people who live alongside them. For now, thank you for listening, and together, let's keep building a more sustainable future.